Hi everyone, today we're diving into how everyday items and necessary services can cost vastly different amounts here in France versus the United States. I'm Susie and I've been living here in Dijon, France for over 16 years. Today I'm comparing prices here in France with the US because that's where I'm originally from, and I tend to default to comparing the two countries that I'm the most familiar with. Plus, I get lots of questions from my American friends who are planning trips here, and from folks like you maybe who are thinking about moving here. Now, before we dive in, we'll have to keep in mind that prices can vary a lot depending on where you are. Paris is going to be different and generally more expensive than smaller cities like Dijon, where I live, just like how prices vary across the US. In this video, we'll look at everyday items like bread to bigger expenses like healthcare. We'll also talk about some surprising items that are actually more expensive here in France, things that may surprise you. Hopefully this will be helpful both for those of you who may be thinking about moving here or who may just be planning a visit. Okay, let's start with the things that are generally less expensive in France. Are pastries and bread cheaper in France? Yes, I think French bakery prices are going to make international pastry lovers jealous. So the first thing we will compare is pain au chocolat, or chocolate croissant, and I did some research online and I found the price of this pastry at 3 well-known American bakeries for $4.50, $5.50, and $6 respectively. Granted, these were all in high cost of living cities, whereas when we did our best chocolate croissants video a few weeks ago, which I'll link to below if you want to check it out, we sampled 5 different bakeries here in Dijon, and the prices ranged from €1.30 to €1.80. Next, French bread, or a baguette. I found one online at Clear Flour Bread in Brookline, Mass. for $2.75 versus Bien Cuit, another bakery in Brooklyn, New York, for $5, whereas I bought this baguette tradition for €1.40 here in Dijon. Next, is French wine cheaper in France? This is a bit hard to compare, but in the name of scientific research, I went to the supermarket and bought 2 bottles of Burgundy White. I picked these because I'm in Burgundy and I wanted to find something local, and also because I thought that with these two I could probably find something similar on sale in the US. And also I picked these because they were relatively affordable. There were lots of bottles of wine in the supermarket that were much cheaper than these two, and then there were tons that were way more expensive as well, so I just kind of went with something that was in my budget. I bought this bottle of 2021 Burgundy Chardonnay for €10.95, although I could not find the exact same bottle for sale in the US. I found this one online, which is similar, for $16.99. Not a huge difference, admittedly. I also bought this bottle of 2022 Saint Véran for €15.95 because I wanted at least 2 bottles to try to compare. This one is comparable to one I found online, which is quite similar and for sale in the US for $28.99. The second difference is more of what I was expecting when I set out to do this experiment, but obviously these are not very scientific results. And of course, it makes sense that French wine would cost more in the US because of the additional costs of exporting it. But if you enjoy French wine and you're coming to France with your American standards of what you usually pay for French wine in the States, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by the affordability, or the relative affordability, of the French wine here. Next, mineral water. Is it cheaper here in France? Well, normally here at home we just drink tap water, but because I was pretty sure that I could find the exact same product on sale here in France and compare it with prices in the US, I went to the supermarket and I picked up a liter bottle of Perrier sparkling water and a liter bottle of Evian still water. How much is 1 liter of Evian? Well, I found online that a bottle exactly like this one is on sale in the US for $2.09, whereas in France, I bought this for 49 cents at the supermarket. Granted, the prices of these products can vary drastically depending on where you're buying them. I just bought these at the supermarket the other day, which probably explains the low price, but you can buy the exact same product from a vending machine or from a fast casual restaurant or from a fancy cafe and expect to pay drastically different prices. And of course, logically, it makes sense that these products cost more in the US. They have been imported from France, and so you're paying a premium for the cost of the export and import. Now we're going to get into more big ticket items, so we're going to talk about transportation. And first, we're going to talk about public transportation, which My impression is that in general it's cheaper here in France than it is in the US, but I'm going to back up my claims with some numbers, so just hold on. And then later on, we'll talk about individual car-related costs, which are not necessarily the same story. First, let's compare the price of one trip on public transit. Here in Dijon, it will cost you €1.40, and you can use the system for up to an hour, compared to in Paris, where it's €2.15, whereas a ride on the T in Boston, for example, is $2.40, or a swipe with your MTA card in New York City is $2.90, according to what I found online. And then we can compare the price of a monthly pass on these same four systems. So here in Dijon, for example, it's €42 compared to €75 or so in Paris, $90 in Boston, or $132 in New York City. And what about a longer ride on the train, for example? Let's compare a round-trip ticket from Boston to New York, which is a distance of 215 miles, on the Acela train, for an average price of between $250 to $400, compared to a train ticket from Dijon to Paris, which is a distance of about 200 miles, on the TGV, which usually costs between 100 and 150 euros. The Boston to New York train takes 3.5 hours, whereas the Paris to Dijon train takes an hour and 40 minutes. So not only are you paying less, but you're also getting there a lot faster. I imagine international viewers out there finding these French train fares relatively affordable, whereas I have to admit, for me, with my relatively modest French salary, these fares do seem relatively expensive, actually. Up until now in the video, the things that we've talked about are things that you may notice the price of if you're even just here for a few days. However, going forward, we're going to talk about things that are sort of recurring expenses that you might have if you're living here or staying here for a longer period of time. Is telecom cheaper here in France? I think it's quite average to pay about 10 to 15 euros a month for a cell phone service. My plan, for example, is 10 euros a month, and that includes 200 gigabytes of data. My husband's plan is 13 euros a month, and we pay 6 euros a month for our teenage son's plan. And all three of us have EU roaming, so we can use our phones anywhere in Europe. And my husband and I also have coverage when we are in the States, which is great and very convenient for when we travel. I'm not sure, I don't know comparatively if that's much cheaper than what you may pay in the US or other parts of the world. Let me know in the comments below and we can compare how much we all pay in our respective countries. For internet, cable, and our landline here at home, we pay 18 euros a month, which also seems relatively affordable to me, but I don't really have any concept of how much people pay for those services in other parts of the world. So you can share how much you pay in the comments below as well if you want. What about healthcare? Here's where the numbers get really interesting and a bit more complicated, but we'll do our best to talk about prescription drugs, doctor's visits, and hospitalizations. Prescription medication is apparently about 60% cheaper on average here in France. This study found that per capita spending on prescription drugs is twice as high in the US as in France. But what portion of prescription drugs are paid for out of pocket versus what's covered? In France, when I go to the pharmacy to pick up a prescription, I usually don't pay anything. Sometimes I'll buy something over the counter like throat lozenges or ibuprofen or allergy medicine or something, and I'll pay a few euros for that out of pocket. And other things that you can buy at the pharmacy without a prescription, you pay for out of pocket as well. So I'm thinking of things like skincare, sunscreen, and bug spray. And what about doctor's visits? Well, when I go to see my primary care physician here in Dijon, I pay 26 euros, 70% of which is reimbursed by the public healthcare system and 30% of which is reimbursed by my private complementary health insurance. It seems hard to figure out how much a doctor's visit in the US costs with so many variables to consider. Looking around online, I saw an incredible range of prices quoted from $80 to $600 for a doctor's visit, and that was not including any tests or procedures. And those amounts just seem unbelievable to me now and would probably seem incredible to most French people as well. In terms of hospitalization, my younger son just got his tonsils out and we paid nothing for the operation in the end. My older son was born here at the hospital in Dijon, and despite a 6-day stay, I didn't pay anything. In fact, a few days after I got home from giving birth, I received a letter in the mail, and in my mind I was like, here's the bill. But I opened it up, and in fact it was just a prescription that I had accidentally left behind, and no bill ever arrived from the hospital. Apparently, the average French person spends about 400 euros per year on out-of-pocket medical expenses, whereas the average American spends about $1,200. We are especially lucky, I think, because we have access to a very high quality, complimentary private insurance called a mutuelle through my husband's employer, and it covers mostly everything, including glasses and orthodontics. So in the end, we don't have to pay anything. We have no out-of-pocket expenses for those types of services. And it's kind of like in the US in that my husband's employer also pays for its employees to have access to this premium plan. So the employer contributes, in this case, 147 euros a month for our family of four to be covered by this premium complimentary insurance company. But my husband also contributes something as well. He contributes 47 euros a month. So it costs about 200 euros a month for our family of four to have access to this complimentary health insurance plan. Now, this is just part of our coverage because we're also covered, of course, by the national healthcare system. And I can't even begin to figure out how much we pay into the system or how much it costs for us as individuals or as a family. It's kind of all rolled up into the ball of all of the taxes that we pay, but maybe someone else out there knows how to figure out how much we pay into the system for the bulk of our healthcare, but I'm really not sure how that works. And while it's tricky for us to calculate exactly how much we are paying for healthcare as individuals, I think this graph is telling in that it shows how much per capita is being spent on healthcare in a sample of countries, including France and the US. Is childcare cheaper in France? So imagine you had your baby at the French hospital. Now what? In France, you'll have a minimum of 16 weeks for your maternity leave, and you'll have more if you had multiples or if it's your third child, plus 28 days of paid leave for the second parent as well. 80% of women return to work within 1 year of having a baby, and I think it's in large part because of the affordability and high quality of childcare here. And there are two heavily subsidized options for childcare in France. There's the crèche, which is a daycare center, or you can hire an assistante maternelle, or colloquially known as a nounou, which is someone who will watch your child in their own home. And I have personally tested out both options. My oldest son got a place in a crèche, and the places are pretty competitive in a sense. Like, I think there's more demand than there are actually spots in the daycare centers. But for our older son, when he was around a year old, we got a spot in a crèche. And so it was heavily subsidized. So we did pay every month, but it wasn't the real true cost of the actual daycare. I think we paid probably a couple €100 a month all told. And it was staffed by professionals. It was very clean. It was very modern. And they provided lunch and snacks and diapers and everything. And my younger son was looked after by a nounou, or an assistante maternelle, in her home. And so this is a bit different. It's kind of like you're the employer and you sort of hire the assistante maternelle. But again, it's all there's sort of like government oversight in the whole process as well. And so what we did, like, sign a contract with her. She had a contract with us for a certain number of hours of care per week. And then we would pay her every month, but the money that we paid her every month was also heavily subsidized by the government. So then I don't know, I can't remember if it was on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis, but then we would receive reimbursement from the CAF, which is like the government welfare office, basically. So we would receive reimbursement for most of what we paid her, I think. And so in the end, I think the amount that we wound up paying out of pocket was probably pretty similar to what we paid for when my older son was at the crèche. So I would say maybe 100 or 200 euros per month, all told, out of pocket for the assistante maternelle for my younger son as well. I think just the fact that I don't remember the amounts that we were paying per month in the end is a sign that it was very affordable, because it wasn't something that broke the bank. It wasn't something that we stressed out about. We knew that either the subsidized crèche or the reimbursements that we would get for what we paid our nounou, we knew that would cover that. We, out of pocket, we only had a couple €100 that we would have to pay for childcare for our kids. I saw online an estimate that said that daycare in the US was about $1,000 to $2,000 per month. I assume that's per kid. I saw some people commenting online in various sources giving their real numbers about how much they pay for daycare. And I saw, for example, this one where it was a couple saying they spent about $1,650 per kid for daycare, and then a commenter responded and said that in Seattle it's more like $2,500 per month per kid. And then I saw another comment in another place online that said that one family was paying $31,000 per year for one kid in daycare in New York City, which also boils down to $2,500 per month as well per kid per day for daycare. I know this is, again, very unscientific, this sample, and that New York and Seattle are very high cost of living areas, but those amounts just seem shocking to me. There is just no way that a typical middle-class family in France could pay that much for childcare. The other thing to remember is that kids in France start school in September of the year they turn 3, and it's free, and it's full-day school. In Dijon anyway, it's Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, full days, and Wednesday, half day. And so, for example, my youngest son who was born in December, he started school in September, the year he was turning 3. So he was 2 years and 9 months old when he started his free full-time school. Granted, the school day here in Dijon anyway is from 8:30 to about 4 o'clock. So you can sign your kids up for preschool care, like in the morning before school starts. You can drop them off at school and somebody's there to watch them. And you can also leave them after school ends, so that you can go and pick them up after work. And for those services, you do have to pay. And then there's also the lunch time at school as well. And some families just pick their kids up for lunch and have, feed their kids at home and bring their kids back to school for the afternoon. But the city also organizes school lunches as well, and you have to pay for that too. So there are some costs associated with kids being in school, but in Dijon, in any case, we pay for these services on a sliding scale. So they calculate how much families pay for these services based on the household's revenue. And just as a side note, despite the fact that our kids are almost 10 and 14 years old, we still receive about 150 euros a month from the government to help us with child-related expenses. Let me know if you want more information about how the government family assistance programs work. I left a lot out here in this video because I really just wanted to focus on childcare, but it's more complex and more generous than what I mentioned here. So if you're interested, just let me know in the comments below and I'll go into more detail in a future video. Okay, it's time to get into the things that are more expensive here in France. So we'll start with car-related expenses. First is gasoline more expensive here in France. We spoke earlier about how public transit can be relatively affordable, but owning and operating your own car, not so much. Let's start with gas prices. In France, gas prices are cheaper now than they were this summer. This video is from the last time I filled up in August. Current prices are about €1.70 per liter, but that's still roughly $6.82 per gallon. Compare that to the US average of about $3.07 per gallon. A lot of the difference comes from the French fuel tax, which averages about 68 cents per liter. I deal with this by just trying not to use my car. Not just because getting around by bike or tram is faster and better for my health and the planet, but also just because using my car is just so expensive. And what about tolls? Are they more expensive here in France? All right, well, let's imagine you have your car and you've filled up your tank and you've decided to take a little road trip. So we're going to compare two possible road trips, one in France and one in the US. If you decide that you want to go from Paris to Marseille, you can take the A6 and the A7 highway. The distance is about 481 miles. It's going to cost you about $71 in tolls if you go through Lyon on your way to Marseille. I tried to imagine a comparable road trip on a toll highway in the States, and I came up with driving from Buffalo to New York City, which is a distance of 371 miles, so a bit shorter. The tolls with your Easy Pass would cost you $28.85. So for a direct comparison, you'd pay about 15 cents per mile to take the French highway compared to 8 cents per mile to take the New York Thruway. Granted, the French highways are quite well maintained, but still so expensive. And what about electronics? Are they more expensive in France? This is something that I've heard a lot of people say, and it's actually kind of easy to compare because we can take the iPhone 15, for example, which is on sale both in the US and in France. And we can just look at the Apple website and compare the prices. And you'll see there is quite a significant difference. I think, for example, here in France, the iPhone 15 starts at 869 euros or $916 compared to the apple.com price, what it's on sale for in the US, which is starting at $699, which is equivalent to 662 euros. So it's the same phone, right? And yet it costs 200 euros more here. So I really struggled to find other things that are more expensive on paper, but I did want to mention that it's just, I think, important to remember that our salaries are just much lower here. So even though things might seem cheaper on paper here in France compared to what you might pay for them in the US, they often just make up a more significant portion of our salaries. So I'm thinking about groceries, for example. When I talk to American visitors, they often tell me that their impression is that food just seems cheaper here in France. And I think that in general, it kind of is. But, and believe me, every few years when I visit the States, I am shocked at how expensive food seems to be there now these days. But I found, for example, this study that said, according to one estimate, the French spend a much larger proportion of their household income on food than Americans do, 13.8 versus 5.7%. And that seems right to me. I really feel like we spend a lot of our income on food. Granted, buying local and organic food is important to me, so maybe that's why our food budget seems relatively high. But it seems like we dedicate a lot of our budget just to buying food, for example. In general, I think it's safe to say that French households spend less out of pocket on healthcare and childcare, but more on food and beverages in relation to their salaries. Tourists visiting France with their US dollars should find things relatively affordable here, with the exception of gas and tolls. And if you're looking to learn more about living in France, you can definitely check out some of the other videos I have here on my channel. For example, I've got this one, which contains some practical advice about moving to France, and another one here where I go through our family's entire budget. So that might give you some more perspective into cost of living and those types of issues that we've discussed here in the video as well. In any case, thank you so much for watching today, and until the next time, à bientôt!